My Personal Recollections of Thomas Troward by Harry Gaze. Chapter 2. My Introduction to Thomas Troward. My own introduction to Thomas Troward was one of the landmarks in my early work in New Thought. It seemed very incidental at the time, for he was then unknown to fame, but it was the beginning of a fruitful friendship. It was when the century was very young indeed. I had first studied Christian Science and then Divine Science and New Thought, commencing in 1890, just 3 years after Queen Victoria's 50-year Jubilee. In 1898, I came to the United States on my first lecture trip. I journeyed by way of Canada to Vancouver and Victoria, and down the Pacific coast to San Francisco and Oakland, later to Los Angeles and other cities and towns in Southern California. 5 years later, in 1903, I returned to my home in England and to the Higher Thought Centre in London, where I had arranged with the secretary, Miss Alice Callow, to give a series of lectures and classes on eternal youth and consciously directed evolution. It was there I first met Mr. Thomas Troward, or Judge Troward, as Americans call him. As he had retired from his duties in India, it was the custom to speak of him in England as Mr. Troward. I have never met a more courteous gentleman, and so natural, sincere, yet helpfully humble in spite of his profound learning. "What can I do to help you?" he wanted to know. "I am not rich, so I cannot help you financially. Perhaps you will give me the pleasure of letting me take up the collection for you, or help you to usher, or I will take the chair for you." As a matter of fact, he did all these things for me in a most gracious and helpful manner. Mr. Troward was most apologetic because there were a few of the lectures and class sermons that a necessary return to his home on the South Coast would cause him to miss. "Can I make up by personal interviews and individual instruction?" he asked. Although his helpfulness would have readily compensated me, the subscription was 10 shillings and 6 pence, or half a guinea, as he called it. The American reader may smile at the amount. Of course, the money had more purchasing power in those Victorian days, but also our New Thought movement was in its early development. What could our mature and learned judge gain from lessons from a young Englishman who had toured the United States for 5 years to lecture on New Thought, Divine Science, and Constructive Psychology? First, I brought him the knowledge of some American books he greatly valued, and which added richly to his knowledge and enabled him to knit together his theories with more positive proof, and second, some positive and original ideas of my own. Foremost among them at that stage in his life were the books of Thompson J. Hudson, LL.D., an American lawyer, the chief of which was his work, The Law of Psychic Phenomena. The painstaking treatment that Hudson gave to the nature of the subjective mind, which the public knows better now by the philosophical research and conclusions of Mr. Troward, seemed to give him solid ground for his beliefs. Hudson conservatively called the ideas he advanced a scientific hypothesis. I knew Thompson Hudson personally. He attended my lecture on How to Live Forever when I visited Cleveland on my way back to England in 1903. He was asked by a mutual friend his opinion of my lecture. He said that he was intrigued by my optimism and thought it wonderfully invigorating suggestion to the subjective mind. He said, however, that he would not like to prolong a life like this. Evidently, he did not fully realize conditions could be corrected. This, of course, could not be called constructive suggestion to the subjective mind, which Hudson himself declared amenable to the power of suggestion, and the builder and chemist of the body. Negatively, Hudson declared, "The good old-fashioned 70 is good enough for me." It was later reported to me that Hudson died on his 70th birthday. This would appear to be remarkable confirmation of the amenability of the subjective mind to the power of the word. Some may think that Mother Nature takes but little notice of our words, but she listens in and engraves them in flesh and blood. Fortunately, the new word, spoken with power, if given in sufficient time, can dissolve the effect of a temporary error. Thomas Troward was deeply impressed with the way that Hudson reasoned in his book on psychic phenomena, and the patient and detailed way he classified the subjects he discussed. Mr. Troward, however, amplified Hudson's idea of the individual subjective mind by considering it as the individual's share in the universal subjective mind, and formulated the tremendously helpful statement that the universal mind has infinite amenability, infinite responsiveness, and infinite creativeness. In its ready and impersonal acceptance of the purposes we impart to it of health, happiness, and all-round well-being, he saw the solution of the great problems of life and attainment. In addition to introducing the works of Hudson to Thomas Troward, I gave him my original contribution of consciously and individually directed evolution as the key to eternal youth and immortality, which includes the whole man, spiritual, mental, and physical. He promised to give this ideal his most earnest consideration, and while he did not personally demonstrate this, he accepted and incorporated it into his teaching when he became a writer in 1904, his first book being the Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science. The theme was elaborated in his later books. While ultimately accepting the full ideal of ageless life, Mr. Troward had a distinctly conservative approach. It required a lot of actual proof to convince him as to the nature of the subjective mind and its full amenability, response, and creative action to suggestion. He was convinced in what then was a novel way. This was by witnessing experiments in hypnotism. Troward, like myself, did not become a practitioner or an advocate of hypnotism, but it was in this type of early research that many of the facts concerning the nature of the subconscious mind were discovered. A theoretical knowledge of the characteristics of the subconscious was insufficient to give him full assurance. His complete confidence came in a most interesting and unusual way. My friend and student, Cornwall Round, was a physician and surgeon, but would insist at that time, I accept the idea of physical as well as spiritual immortality, but please do not publicize me as doctor or I may be ruled out of the medical profession. He explained that it was against the ethical code of the BMA, the British Medical Association, to use the title of doctor in connection with his personal opinions in the press. He had experimented extensively with hypnotic subjects. Some of his results were so full of interest and significance, we decided to help Mr. Troward and a few others by arranging a series of experiments in Dr. Round's house. The group that gathered for this purpose was mostly composed of officers of the Psychotherapeutic Society, and nearly all physicians who had accepted and practiced mental healing. Dr. Round decided to go entirely out of the professional hypnotic field to find a suitable object. He decided, after some discussion, to call in a streetwalker to whom a fee was paid, considerably in excess of that which she earned in her regular calling. The young woman consented to becoming the hypnotic subject for the evening, after being fully assured by the physicians that the experiments would not in any way harm her. Fortunately, she proved to be a good subject for the test. She possessed a faculty for concentration. It is very difficult to hypnotize a mind wanderer. First, she was required to look intently at a bright, shining coin, and then directly into the eyes of the operator. In a quiet but positive voice, Dr. Round repeated a number of times, "You are a high priestess in the temple of the sun. You have a message for those who are here. You will speak to us clearly and brilliantly. You know great truths. You will tell us about them. You have wise and able associates, and you are open to their wisdom. You are fluent and able. Remember, you are a wise high priestess, and you can instruct us." After much repetition, in substantially the same words, her regular, personal characteristics seemed to disappear, and a new and more attractive individual appeared. Finally, she lifted herself up, proudly, and even regally, in impersonation of a goddess, and launched into a discourse in which she talked eloquently and learnedly of life, philosophy, and immortality. Thomas Troward was profoundly impressed, as were the others, some of whom had previously tested hypnosis for medical usage, sometimes as an anesthetic for the milder operations. Mr. Troward exclaimed, "This certainly proves there is a subjective mind that can accept and impersonate what is vividly suggested when hypnotism has placed the conscious mind in abeyance, but of course the thought is the real power." Interestingly, the company had various views about the source of the phenomenon. One man was positive the subject matter of the discourse, as well as her changed deportment, were supplied by a control in the form of a disembodied spirit of great intelligence. He saw in these results a proof of spirit communication. The consensus of opinion, however, shared by Mr. Troward, Dr. Round, and myself, was that it illustrated the normal powers of the subjective mind, and that the ideas advanced were a composite of the ideas held by those present, or ideas received from the treasury or storehouse of the universal subjective mind. In some ways the experiment was as dramatic as the story of Svengali and Trilby, in which the commonplace singer impersonated the marvelous singer until the hypnotic influence was removed by the operator's death. It is indeed true that truth is stranger than fiction. In this case, a speaker was impersonated instead of a singer, and one presenting remarkable thoughts concerning the deep philosophies of life. Mr. Troward agreed with me that while hypnotism, in trustworthy hands, for research purposes, demonstrated quite quickly and dramatically to seekers and skeptics the marvelous powers of the mind, the results of thought power were better in the long run when the cooperation of the subject's whole mind, subjective and objective, with the priority of spiritual cooperation, was obtained. Cornwall Round was, like his name, quite round and plump. In his younger years he had been an officer in the army, and he sometimes wondered if some indulgences in his early years might keep him from the full demonstration of the life abundant. He had a knowledge of Hinduism in which some groups took a fatalistic view of karma. Although he accepted in principle the relationship of the subjective and objective minds, and the amenability of the subjective together with its power of building and rebuilding the body, he frequently made himself an exception to the rule. The spiritual, which is always the truly dynamic power in healing, did not impress him as deeply as the influence of mental suggestion. Granted that suggestion is a factor in healing, we may still question concerning the quality of suggestion to be used. It is certainly not a complete idea to say that suggestion or thought is the healing influence. Obviously, thought and suggestion can cure or kill. We must make it divine thought and word. The action of the mind is not complete unless we take into full consideration and practice our relationship with superconscious mind. To know God is life eternal. I do not mean that Cornwall Round left God out of his thought. It was a matter of emphasis and proportion. Thomas Troward constantly stressed the understanding of God as the self-originating and affirmative spirit, and the self-contemplation of divine spirit. Dr. Round's gardener on his mother's beautiful estate was still active in his 100th year, and he had wondered whether his secret of lasting youthfulness was to gather dewdrops at the dawn of day in quantity enough to drink. This, of course, would simply be distilled water, but exceptionally well aerated by the fresh morning air. This idea was seemingly borne out by the fact that the weathered gardener contacted the grass with his fingers at the dawn of day and applied something to his mouth. Dr. Round's curiosity eventually caused him to use his telescope on the centenarian at this early hour. To his astonishment, he saw him take the small round slugs from the grass and put them in his mouth, and devour them with evident satisfaction. Dr. Round was greatly intrigued. He linked it in some way with the current interest in what was known as organotherapy. "It is live protoplasm," he declared. It was, however, only a 9 days' wonder to him. I feel assured that my readers will not accept my relating this little story of the doctor and the centenarian as a recommendation to emulate his diet. The value of Thomas Troward's friendship with Cornwall Round was not that the good doctor's views could be followed at all times, but his scientific tests of mind power helped to dramatize the nature of mind and provide material for closer spiritual and mental reflection. In those days, a tennis champion, an all-round athlete, as well as a mental and physical health teacher named Eustace Miles, ran a large food reform restaurant on Chandos Street, just off Trafalgar Square in London. In quite a unique way, he combined his food shop with a lecture salon, in which a variety of teachings included food study, scientific breathing, and metaphysics. Dr. Round invited me to dinner at this restaurant. Among the items on the menu was a meat substitute in which there was a combination of yeast, beans, whole wheat breadcrumbs, and perhaps other ingredients. The idea in Eustace Miles's mind was to provide meals that were meatless, yet so closely resembling the look and taste of meat that the most confirmed meat eater would never miss his steaks and chops. In this, he was quite successful. My meal seemed quite fairly satisfactory. Though I did not eat meat anyway, therefore did not need a transitional diet resembling meat in taste or appearance. In fact, I would prefer my food not to resemble flesh food. That night, I had distress in my stomach of such an acute order as I had never before experienced. I told Dr. Round about it the next day. He was filled with almost a schoolboy glee and rubbed his hands with delight. It was hard for me to see the joke. He explained enthusiastically that he had identically the same experience for the first time he tried this type of food and suggested that we invite Thomas Troward to this restaurant to dinner and see how the combination of ingredients would agree with him. This, he declared with zestful anticipation, would be just a matter of scientific research. I persuaded him that it would really teach us nothing new, and there was no wisdom in making him suffer as a human guinea pig. I understand that in modern vegetarian restaurants, a different combination and a different form of yeast is used to give the meaty flavor and nutriment. However, our spiritual, mental, and emotional states are closely related to our complete nourishment, and the mental factor is always present. Both Mr. Troward and I enjoyed a number of deliciously prepared vegetarian meals in the beautiful home of the Roundses, for they had a wonderful cook and housekeeper who knew how to cook the foods conservatively and thus retain their full flavor and virtue. Then we would have the opportunity of an exchange of thought on the things that make for life abundant. Sometimes a group of physicians would gather, and we would discuss subjects under the head of psychotherapeutics, of which the modern version is psychosomatics, or soul-body relationship. Footnote: Thomas Troward was a vice president of the Psychotherapeutic Society. Thomas Troward, relieved of the necessity of a lecture manuscript, was an animated and earnest participant in these conversations. The groups meeting at the Higher Thought Center worked strictly along metaphysical and spiritual lines, and it was in this atmosphere that he gave and received help and highest inspiration. He realized also the value of the introductions to brilliant men in the home of Dr. Cornwall Round, and gathered many ideas from their talks, from which he occasionally made notes for future reference and study. In a chapter entitled Race Thought and New Thought in his book The Creative Process in the Individual, Mr. Troward calls attention to the writing of Dr. Cornwall Round. This was something unusual for him to do, as he made it an almost inflexible rule to mention or quote only the scriptures. A number of teachers whom he personally and warmly thanked for their contributions to his knowledge are not mentioned. At first, and with only casual thought, this might appear somewhat selfish. From first-hand knowledge of him, however, I know that this was not the case. By quotation from others in some idea he approved, he did not want to seemingly endorse other ideas that might be held by the individual. His inborn caution kept him from even seemingly sponsoring ideas which he had not explored in the most exhaustive detail. He was safe in talking impersonally on the principle in which he believed. Whatever of truth he accepted, he felt, was, from that time, an entirely impersonal matter. In this exceptional instance, which calls attention to the rule, in a footnote he commends the reader to see Self-Synthesis by Dr. Cornwall Round. The full title sounds more interesting, I think. Now out of print for many years, it was entitled Self-Synthesis, A Means to Perpetual Life. As the title indicates, Dr. Round based the teaching on the power of the subjective to build and rebuild the body to a higher and more perfect degree when so instructed by the knowledge and word power of the objective or conscious mind. The power of hypnotism is wholly in the quality of the suggestions made by the operator. The hypnosis is merely the opportunity of giving the suggestions directly to the subconscious mind of the subject. The conscious or objective mind would argue and question the truth of the suggestions and probably refute them. At the very least, they would be governed by previous education and experience, even if quite faulty. In the state of hypnosis, a new and temporary personality is created, consisting of the operator's conscious mind and the subject's subconscious mind. The subject carries out its normal tendency of impersonating the predominant mental ideas given by the operator. The subconscious accepts and does not argue. Experience, however, has shown that this is a temporary phenomenon. In order to carry the work further from a mere assumption of the character impersonated under the operator's influence to normal and actual personification and embodiment would require the intense interaction of the whole mind of the subject in resolute training and culture in complete integration. The streetwalker did not become a great speaker and wise philosopher. The effect was temporary because the influence was not her own. She returned to her usual occupation. One may, of course, inquire what would have been the effect if this interested group could have taken her into more or less permanent re-education, with a view to reconstruction of her life. Certainly, such transformations have been made without the aid of hypnotism. On this occasion, the experiment had the specific purpose of giving Thomas Troward the opportunity of witnessing the nature of the subjective mind and its response to thought and word. All were fully agreed that the knowledge of hypnosis placed a great and solemn responsibility on the part of any who participated in it. If a surgeon must have exquisite skill and must have a clean heart and also clean antiseptic hands, how much more should one entrusted with a subject who for the time being is a complete passive believer, have a pure soul and a clean heart and mind? It must also be remembered that not only goodness of motive is to be considered, for the question comes whether even the best motives of one individual are for the best interests of another individual in all cases. I do not recall the exact conversations of those present at Cornwall Round's experiment with his odd subject and the results obtained, but they were quite along the line I have just repeated. There was a difference of opinion between some of the doctors regarding the question of complete control in hypnotic action. The question of whether a subject might commit a crime under hypnosis was discussed. Some thought this distinctly possible. Dr. Round assured them that as a result both of his study of the work of others and his own work, if even a minor infraction of moral law by the subject's conception of morals was suggested, the subject would become greatly distressed and awaken to normal consciousness for protection. Might it not, however, provide the occasion which otherwise might not occur? This prompt awakening was because the nature of the subconscious is very complex and is not only responsive to suggestion, but is the seat of the individual's life instinct for self and others, and is a protective power. While this appears very logical, one of the doctors present strongly objected to this view, and Thomas Troward, like the good judge he had been in India, said that he would reserve his opinion until he had given it more mature reflection. It is reported in these later years that hypnotism has aided dentists in their work, enabled doctors to perform the lesser operations without the use of anesthetics, and has been of assistance in childbirth and in the correction of undesirable habits. There are still many questions to be asked concerning the use of hypnosis. In New Thought, while seeking to keep an open mind, its ministrations do not in the slightest way include hypnotism. Christian Science also rigidly excludes it. It is claimed by some scientists that there is still room for strictly scientific investigation, for its possibilities under rightful conditions have not yet been fully explored, although so much time has passed. It should positively never be used for purposes of amusement. I have treated this subject at some length because even a mention of hypnotism is sometimes mistaken as an endorsement of its practice.